Alright guys, Tyler down here at Emerald City Guitars. And if you follow this channel, you know we never have a shortage of cool Fender guitars in the shop, and this is one of the coolest currently in the shop in my opinion. This is a 1951 Fender Telecaster. Now, the term 1951 Fender Telecaster can often sound strange to people, and I think that's because we tend to compartmentalize the Blackguard years in such a way that 1950 equals the Broadcaster, 51 equals the Notecaster, and 52 on is the Telecaster, which is largely true, but of course these changes didn't occur right on January 1st of every year, so we're left with these sort of fluid transitional periods where we can see some really cool mixtures of features on these guitars, and this is certainly an example of that. Now, as we know, Fender started the production of the Broadcaster in October of 1950. Now, they made about 275 of these before February 20th of 1951, when very famously Gretsch sent Fender a telegram making them aware of their trademark on the Broadcaster name. Now, you'll often hear people refer to this as a cease and desist, but it wasn't that at all. It didn't get to that point. It was just a telegram from Gretsch saying, hey, please stop using this name, and they did right away. So February 20th of 1951, Fender started clipping the decals and continued production of the Notecaster, of course called the Notecaster because it had no model name on the headstock. Now, it's worth noting that the very earliest Notecasters actually had neck dates from the second week of February, even before the telegram arrived, but that's just because those necks were already in production and already in the finishing process. Now, the term Telecaster was actually coined almost immediately after they received this telegram from Gretsch, like within a few days. The problem was they clipped a ton of decals. And of course, if you know anything about Fender, they never like to waste money. So they used up all of these clipped decals until about the second week of September of that year. Now, from mid-February to mid-September of 1951, Fender made about 480 of these Notecasters. So from mid-September to the end of the year, Fender was making 1951 Telecasters. And having such a short production time at the end of that year meant that there were very few of these made, something like 240 total. So the 1951 Telecaster is actually rarer than the Broadcaster. So earlier I mentioned that some of these have a cool mix of features, so let's talk about this one. One of the most prominent features of 1951 Telecasters that is unique to 1951 Telecasters is the decal placement. As you can see, it runs kind of parallel to the string path, kind of pointing towards the string tree. Now, this is an artifact from the days of the Notecaster. Now, back in the days of the Broadcaster, the logo was placed pretty similar to what we'd expect to see today, kind of at a pretty pronounced angle there. But when they started clipping decals and making the Notecasters, for whatever reason, Fender moved the alignment of the decal kind of in line with the strings. Now, for what reason, I don't know exactly. I guess maybe they thought it looked better with no model name on there. But when they started making Telecasters in late 1951, they kept that orientation. So you'll see a very unique and unusual logo placement on the 51 Teles. This switched in very early 1952, so it's pretty exclusive to these 51 Teles. Now, the finish on these 51 Teles is also something to note. In the early years of the model, Fender was still experimenting, refining their finishing process quite a bit, changing processes and materials. And so early Fender guitars can often vary quite a bit in finish. Now, on these late 51 Teles, the finish is very, very thin, almost like a Broadcaster. It wears and checks very similar to a Broadcaster. Now, Notecasters before this, they tend to be a little bit more opaque and creamy in the color. And the 52 Teles that came after this tend to be a lot more glossy and thick as far as the finish goes. So a cool little window in Fender's finishing history on the 51 Tele. Now, the neck profile on 1951 Telecasters is kind of its own thing. They tend to be on the thinner side and kind of flat on the back as far as profile goes. Now, when people think of 1951 Fender necks, of course, they usually think of a big, chunky, soft V maybe, characteristic of the Notecaster, but these weren't like that at all. They thinned down quite a bit, and they hadn't quite filled out to the full C shape that we've come to know on later 52 Telecasters. So it was right around the end of 1951 where we start to see the transition from all flathead screws to some Phillips head screws. Now, when Fender did the 52 reissue back in, I don't know, the 80s or 90s or whatever, they came out with all flathead screws. So people tend to think that this transition happened a little bit later, but it did start towards the end of 1951. And you'll see here on this guitar, we have Phillips head fasteners on the control plate as well as the bridge plate. Those were generally the first to transition. Soon after that, we'll start to see the neck plate screws transition to Phillips, as well as the strap button screws, which we do see on this guitar. So it's around this time as well that we start to see Phillips head truss rod nuts, but that transition did take a long time. You'll see flathead truss rod nuts up into 52, 53, and beyond. But this one is one of the very first Phillips truss rod nuts. Now these tuners are closed shell no-line Klusons, just like we'd see on earlier no-casters. It was very early in 1952 that we'd switch to a similar tuner but with an open shell. So this is kind of the last of the no-caster tuners. There's some various pieces of hardware that are also kind of holdovers from the broadcaster no-caster era. The jack cups are the milled variety. Of course, in 1952, these would change to the press molded ones. The knobs are very similar to no-caster knobs. A little bit shorter than broadcaster, but still quite a bit flatter on top than we'll see in the 1952 knobs. Even the strap buttons are a little bit different. They tend to be a little flatter on top with a flatter base, a slightly different profile than we'll see just the following year. Now the base plates of these lead bridge pickups, of course on the early guitars, were zinc plated steel. And it's right around late 1951 where we see those transition to the copper-plated steel ones that we know and love today. Now, this base plate is the copper-plated variety, so it's got to be one of the very first to come out of the Fender line there. Now, speaking of this lead pickup, it was wound with 42 gauge magnet wire, which sounds like a normal thing, and it is now. However, earlier broadcasters and no-casters were actually wound with 43 gauge wire, the thinner stuff that was used on neck pickups. Now, this can sound good, but generally compared to 42, it's a thinner, more trebly sound, which, the broadcasters had no problem producing high end. So towards the middle, late 1951, Leo changed to winding these bridge pickups with 42 gauge wire, which is the industry standard even to this day. Now there are a few other kind of minor things, like for example on 1950 and 1951 guitars, generally the routes for the pickups and controls were very, very tight. So getting, the pickups in and out was kind of a bother. In 1952, these were opened up a little bit, I think to make production easier. But on this one, the cavities are very tight. So another little minor thing is in this bridge pickup cavity. There's a router mark that's on the forwardmost corner of the route. Now in other eras, it's positioned on one of the outboard corners, but on 51 Tele specifically, it's always sitting on this front corner. Things like the switch tip. On 1950 and earlier 1951 models, they have a patent pending mark on the bottom, whereas in late 51 they started showing patent number. There are a ton of little things like that that I could, pore over for days. However, like I said, this is just a really cool mixture of features that harken back to the days of the broadcaster, but also touch on the later, more refined design of the Telecaster that went on to become industry standard. The 1951 Telecaster is rarer than the broadcaster. It is always such a treat to have one in the shop. If you're local, please come in and check this thing out. I know you'll fall in love with it like I did.
Thank